Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded, and we have a fantastic year of programs. It is our fifth year doing this with the 101s, and we hope you can join us throughout the year. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. And now I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Andrew Klump is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not be able to get to all of the questions before we get there. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Cory Haala. Cory Haala is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point with a PhD in U.S. history from Marquette University. He is the author of a book in progress with University of Illinois Press, How Democrats Won the Heartland, Progressive Populism in the Age of Reagan, 1978 to 1982, as well as several published chapters on Midwestern political history. One on the rise of Terry Branstad and Charles Grassley in the Republican Party of Iowa in the 2020 volume, The Conservative Heartland, another on the rebuilding of the South Dakota Democratic Party in the early 1980s in the Plains Political Tradition, Volume 3. And if you're interested in today's talk, one coming out soon on the grassroots fight for progressive foreign policy in the 1980s and the liberal heartland, out with University Press of Kansas in April 2025. He's also written for Time Magazine's Made by History series on the political traditions of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and appeared recently on Indiana Public Media's Inner States podcast, discussing the history of grassroots organizing and the politics in the 1980s Midwest. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Cory to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to the entire State Historical Society of Iowa. I'm really excited to be here today talking with you all. Thanks for those of you who are joining us live today. Thanks to those of you who are watching this later on YouTube. As Matt mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about today is the kind of resurgence of left-wing politics in Iowa in the 1980s. And you can see two of kind of the big figures here. Iowa Senator Tom Harkin, who's first elected to the Senate in 1984, as well as two-time presidential candidate Jesse Jackson, a civil rights leader, the leader of the Rainbow Coalition, its political arm in the 1980s. It's seen their campaigning in Iowa. But also talking a lot today about the grassroots political activists, a lot of the kind of the rank and file, the working class, the average people who made a democratic comeback in the 1980s possible. And really emphasizing today some of the ways in which grassroots politics, working class politics in Iowa, at one point really had this kind of vibrant outpouring and this real national impact. We're going to look at some of the legislation today, some of the campaigns, some of the ways in which we see this Democratic and Democratic Party politics, but also what I'll talk about is both progressive and populist politics today as well. Looking at ways in which things like economic democracy, economic justice, were central to political coalitions in Iowa, particularly in the 1980s. As I do that, though, I want to make sure that we have an understanding of kind of how far the party had fallen by 1980. And Iowa Democratic politics in the 1970s were characterized toward the end of the decade by defeat. From the popular Governor Harold Hughes in the 1960s, turned senator in the 1970s, Iowa Democrats winning both the state Senate seats, with Dick Clark winning in 1972, walking across the entire state of Iowa very famously, and John Culver winning in 1974. By 1980, Iowa has lost both of those Senate seats. Roger Jepsen, Republican, defeating Clark in 1978, and Charles Grassley defeating Culver in 1980. But these having statewide impacts that kind of down the ballot as we look, Iowa Republicans taking control of both the state House and the state Senate in just a matter of 4 years between 1976 and 1980, as well as statewide defeats for Democratic candidates for governor, Jerry Fitzgerald losing to very popular moderate Republican Robert Ray in 1978, as well as in 1980 the defeat of a proposed equal rights amendment that would add sex to the state constitution. that year as well. So there's kind of to start with a working understanding here that Iowa Democratic politics in 1980 are kind of at a little bit of a trough relative to the kind of decades surrounding. And what we'll look at today are ways in which Iowa progressives at the grassroots in particular, but into the Iowa Democratic Party and then into national campaigns, rebuilt some of that both party strength, but some of that grassroots enthusiasm as well for some of these causes that pushed back against things like corporate power, pushed back against some of the social conservatism that defeated the Equal Rights Amendment, and some of these other trends. And just to give you an idea of what kinds of victories we're talking about here, by 1990, going into the 1990 elections, these are the kind of the Democratic successes you see in the state of Iowa. Democrats have not only retaken majorities in both houses of the state legislature, they've retaken big ones. 60%, 3/5 of both the state house and the state senate in Iowa in 1989 are Democratic. They've elected now Tom Harkin one time in 1984, but he would go on to be the first Democratic senator from Iowa ever to win and serve two full consecutive terms, with all apologies to Guy Gillette and his political legacy in the 40s and into the 50s. Um, but it's also worth understanding here that while my title today is about Tom Harkin and is about Jesse Jackson, that there's also a really rich tradition here down the ballot in the state of Iowa. There's a deep bench of politicians on in the Democratic column in Iowa, and we're going to see victories for lieutenant governor, both with Robert Anderson as well as Joanne Zimmerman in 1982 and 86. Elaine Baxter becoming Secretary of State in 1986. Tom Miller and Bonnie Campbell winning elections for Attorney General. Secretary of Agriculture Dale Cochran winning in 1986 as well. This kind of deep bench, but this grassroots enthusiasm that supported these Democratic victories. Now, it's worth noting, and one of the central kind of takeaways I'd love for you all to have watching this is that the language that Democrats used to rebuild that coalition was a language that talked very intentionally and very specifically about the word populism. Okay? And we'll look at how progressive populism and some other kind of variations on that word matter within this era. But it's worth noting that these activists within the 1980s very intentionally saw and defined themselves as populists. Okay? Now, Harkin is one of kind of the leading proponents of this idea of populism, and you can see him as one of the disfigured caricatures, I suppose, there on the in the image. It's worth noting that's not even my scan. That's just how they drew him in LA in 1987. But Harkin defined this kind of populism as economic democracy. And it was something that was built as being focused on both agrarian and urban problems, as talking about an economic system that had kept the big power big and kept the little guy down. Okay? Encouraging Iowans to see themselves as the little guy, because they were, right? And encouraging them as a result to vote for candidates who promised to elevate the little guy, who promised to restore that kind of citizen control of politics to both Iowa government, but to national government as well. But crucial to understanding that kind of left-wing populism, and they really did see it as being democratic in nature, okay, was a historical understanding of the word populism. If you've heard the phrase the cross of gold speech before, or somebody like William Jennings Bryan, you might be familiar with the general idea that in the early 1890s, and we just jumped back 90 years in history. I apologize for how abrupt that might have been. But in the 1890s, okay, a movement of farmers, okay, a movement of rural people, particularly in Iowa, but especially in Nebraska on the plains, stretching all the way down into Texas. Okay, a group of rural people got together and called themselves the People's Party or the Populist Party. In 1892, they met in Omaha, Nebraska, and articulated a political platform, okay, that would be known as the Omaha Platform. With the banner Equal Rights to All, Special Privileges for None, the People's Party ran Iowan James Weaver as their presidential candidate in 1892. And despite just being a few months old that November, Weaver took multiple states' electoral votes that fall. Iowans and activists that affiliated with Iowa kind of farm protest movements in the 1980s saw themselves as being in this tradition. You see there's somebody allied with the North American Farm Alliance, a Des Moines-based farm activist group in the 1980s, talking about how the government and governmental policies are only acting as handmaidens for the corporations. Our populist kind of critique there, right? That the big guy stays big and the government's there to help him out. Yeah. Now, this is, again, one of these activists in the 1980s reading and saying, if I read my history of the populist movement correctly, they identified their problem very clearly as the banks and the railroads. In that Omaha platform, the Populist Party called for, if necessary, the nationalization, okay, of railroads and the nationalization of telegraphs. Okay, federal policies in terms of monetary policy and agricultural policy that were designed to support the little guy, the average family farmer in places like Iowa and Nebraska, against the government and against railroad corporations and against bankers. They saw it in the 1890s, the problems very similar to how 1980s activists saw these problems. But if that weren't enough, Iowa activists in the 1980s also had the populism of the 1930s to fall back on. Okay? You'd find frequently them comparing the farm crisis. Okay? And we'll talk about what that is in just a second, but I know you've had Pam Riney Kierberg speak as part of Iowa History 101, the great Iowa State University historian, looking at how populism in the 1980s and in the farm crisis really echoed that kind of protest in the 1930s. FDR actually did call Milo Reno, a leader of the farm holiday movement, and you can see farm holiday protesters blocking roads there in Sioux Falls in 1930. I'm sorry, in Sioux City, excuse me, in 1932. FDR actually calling up the farm holiday movement and saying we've got a revolution out there, haven't we? But allied politicians to these Iowa activists in the 1980s saying that this is going to make the 1930s look like a garage sale, that we're going to revive this kind of protest, revive this kind of activism, and apply it to the challenges that we're facing here in the 1980s. And goodness knows there were a lot of challenges. Okay? Just to breeze over a lot of those really quickly, you can see some of the net take-home pay for some of the leaders of the farm activist movement in the 1980s. Broadly speaking, this farm crisis of the era being really this widespread and this just economic catastrophe. Farmland in Iowa loses about $1,300 in value per acre between 1981 and 1986. By 1983, the outstanding federal farm loans across the country total $82 billion. Nearly 500,000 farms across the country have nearly 500,000 farms across the country have reported financial problems in this era, and that is nowhere more so true than in Iowa, where the very high-profile murder of bankers by a farmer near Lone Tree, Iowa, in 1985 grabbed national headlines. Right, that there are these really transformative, really catastrophic losses within the Iowa farm community in the 1980s. But those are struggles as well that extend to labor in Iowa too. Okay, the deindustrialization, that the farm slowdown affects meatpacking plants, affects farm implement manufacturing at places like Hormel, like Iowa Beef Packers, as well as at John Deere. And we see really high-profile strikes coming to cities like Waterloo, like Ottumwa in 1986 and 1987. And these labor struggles really go hand in hand with the Iowa farm movement. Something that I think it's worth impressing upon us today is that we can't understand one without understanding the other, particularly because it was solidarity between those movements that led to the rebuilding of this farm movement in the 1980s. Sorry, this democratic and this progressive movement in the 1980s. Those challenges extended as well to fights for equal rights and equal pay, both in minority communities across Iowa and in women's rights circles as well. And we'll see Iowa feminists fighting hand in hand with Iowa labor as a means of building political strength in this era. And I want to note the power of money in politics, not just not on farms, but rather in the political action committees that spring up in the late 1970s and early 1980s and really play an instrumental role in the defeats of both Dick Clark and John Culver. The Mid-America Conservative Political Action Committee, founded by Leroy Cory out of Waterloo, Iowa, really playing an active role helping fund the National Conservative Political Action Committee, helping be its local arm in 1978 and 1980, and funding these smear campaigns, calling Dick Clark, quote, the senator from Africa, for his humanitarian work, attacking John Culver as well in both of those elections. A great deal of the rebuilding, then, a great deal of taking on these kinds of organizations and these groups comes from the grassroots in Iowa in the 1980s. And you can see kind of a laundry list here of some of the activist groups. And none of these groups today in this talk will get kind of fair shrift. And I'd encourage you. I have a book coming out hopefully soon. I have a chapter coming out, and I talk about each of these groups at greater length in those. And I'd really encourage you to dive into each one of those groups' histories. Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, in particular, has a great website where they document some of their history. But these activist groups, right, not just talking about the farm crisis, but talking about broadly the crisis that working class people across the state of Iowa face, really begin to organize and move into kind of a very public role in the 1980s by talking about each of their individual crises, not in terms of just the one class of people, whether it's tenants in the case of Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, whether it's senior citizens who are facing high energy bills and are facing utility shutoffs, as the Iowa Citizen and Labor Energy Coalition did, not just talking about family farmers, as the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition did, and not just talking about issues like a nuclear freeze or opposition to the Cold War anti-communist policies of Republican President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. But these activist groups in the 80s started to see and to talk about their issues as issues of broadly economic justice, okay? Saying that we can have both peace and agriculture. We can have, to use perhaps a snappier slogan, coalition in 1983. Ways in which these um, ways in which these movements attempted to really start building kind of inter-movement solidarities, ways in which they started to build bridges between some of these various activist communities. By the mid-1980s, with the deepening of the farm crisis, groups like Prairie Fire Rural Action, constituted as such in 1985, held silent vigils and sit-ins at Republican Governor Terry Branstad's State of the State address. That's them there in the galleries, about 300 people in January of 1985, calling for an immediate moratorium on farm foreclosures when farmers wouldn't be able to pay back their loans. They'd be facing foreclosures. The banker, the sheriff would come out to the farm and auction it off. Prairie Fire and other activist groups like this were very prominent in leading this fight. And not only to stop the farm foreclosures, going out and holding what were called penny auctions, or going out and chanting, drowning out the auctioneer until they abandoned trying to sell the farm, but taking this into a more policy oriented approach, taking their fight to the state capitol quite literally, and demanding that state legislative actors, that the governor and that national figures as well, take action in order to stop the farm crisis. This boiled over, as scholars like Pam Riney Kierberg and others have noted, into very prominent national actions like the National Farm Crisis Action Rally. That's in Ames in the Hilton Coliseum in 1985. Speakers, and a wide range of speakers, from the very progressive Bishop of Des Moines, Maurice Dingman, all the way to Governor Terry Branstad, spoke at that rally, attended by over 10,000 people. But it took on despite being a very bipartisan event, it took on a very decidedly left-leaning kind of tone. They booed the president of the Conservative Farm Bureau, Dean Kleckner, who was an Iowan. They also hanged a Reagan budget official in effigy outside Hilton Coliseum. This was something that was angry, and that was trying to turn that kind of righteous anger that they felt into action by speaking not just about it as a farm crisis, but as Dingman did, speaking about it as a religious kind of a crisis as well, a fight for the soul of America, something that not just farmers, but working class people in Iowa were demanding to be heard. And it's worth noting these groups did have over time a political impact. Groups like Iowa Farm Unity had been running a farm crisis telephone hotline And they felt miffed when in 1985 Branstad repackaged it and ran using the state extension services, a telephone hotline of their own for farmers who were having mental health crises, who were facing financial crises, and didn't know where to turn. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that Iowa Farm Unity and other groups, by operating those phone hotlines, did then push state government to act and to create these systems that would help family farmers. They successfully pushed Branstad to declare a farm foreclosure moratorium, a year's worth of no foreclosures on family farms in October of 1985, and pushed for the passage in 1987 of the Iowa Homestead Act as well, which gave farmers the first right, if they'd been foreclosed on, to buy back their farms. Uh, you can see that these are, again, organized kinds of movements that aren't just protest in the streets, but are also trying to make sure that they take legislative action. You can see their Iowa Farm Unity, a little tongue in cheek, begging people to please, won't you adopt a legislature? Adopt a legislator. It's a tragic sight, they said. Lonely and lost, stumbling through an endless maze of bills and regulations at the state capitol. They often fall prey to the questionable intentions of agribusiness lobbyists, or worse yet, wayward farm organizations. Iowa Farm Unity is taking a very deliberate and very populist shot there, right? At groups like the Farm Bureau, at some of these, at this kind of corporate bigness that we've seen invading states like Iowa and kind of taking over and leading to the demise in some cases of family farming. It's worth noting these political activist groups also had an impact in terms of bringing more people into the political process in the state of Iowa. Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement claimed in 1984 that they had registered 16,000 new citizens to vote, that they were engaged in not just the idea of, hey, defending the little guy, but getting more little guys to see or to think that they had a vested interest in participating in politics. But that included as well an Iowa that was becoming more diverse in the 1980s. Future state representative Wayne Ford, working in Des Moines, established what was at the time called the Brown and Black Coalition, later the Black and Brown Forum. They held their first event to a standing room only crowd, a very hastily organized event, but a very successful one, hosting 450 people at the Tiny Tot Child Care Center in Des Moines, and getting the men who were running for president for the Democratic nomination in 1984, getting them to come out and talk about minority issues, establishing a precedent and a tradition still active today. It's worth noting that this is all part of the attempts to build a broader sense of farm and labor solidarity among the Iowa working class in the 1980s. To say that this is not just the farm crisis, this is not just a crisis in labor, but these are a common kind, these are common causes. Average people need to work together to take back political power for themselves. And one of the key moments in that is what's called Farm Labor Solidarity Day. This takes place in a few different states, particularly Minnesota and Iowa have the two largest rallies. Farm Labor Solidarity Day held on November 1st of 1983. And just for maybe if there's any other Minnesotans, I'll confess to being one here in this talk, but other Minnesotans in the audience, this is very intentionally calling upon, again, one of these kind of radical populist traditions. In Minnesota, the Democratic Party there is not known as the Democratic Party, but it's called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, a hyphenated word. And this farm labor kind of solidarity they're calling back to is something that was an outcropping of, again, the 1930s, that kind of farm holiday unrest that was in both in Iowa and in Minnesota. Farm Labor Solidarity Day in Waterloo on November 1st of 1983 took the form of a free breakfast at the UAW local hall 838 in Waterloo, right there on the main drag as you drive through Waterloo. This was attended by over 1,000 people. Kind of the number of people we're talking about who are facing these kind of challenges economically in the 1980s. You can see from the Omaha World Herald's recap of the event there on the right. This is attended by farmers, by unemployed workers, by minorities, who heard speeches really from a wide range of people. But you can see within the sponsors of this event, right, that Iowa Farm Unity is there. The North American Farm Alliance is there. The UAW Local 838, the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 46 are all there attending and active at this event. Iowa farmers themselves donated 68 hogs. Now that was to be symbolic, both in the sense of um, wanting to help out, and feed the workers. But Iowa farmers protest as well that they weren't getting a fair price for their hogs, anyways. Farm prices, remember, in that crisis were so depressed that they said we might as well donate these hogs because we're not going to get a fair price that's going to help us out anyway. They were processed then. Okay, they were made into sausage by the UFCW's Local 46 at the Rath Packing Company in Waterloo, and they were distributed. Okay, 10,000 pounds of sausage being distributed to out of work and or underemployed workers in Waterloo at this event, followed again by a free Depression style. There's that allusion to the Great Depression again, a Depression style bean soup and bread lunch. But at this event as well, it wasn't just feeding them. It was talking next about political action. And there was a panel discussion that followed it. Jim Reardon from the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, who was by then an advisor to Iowa's Democratic Lieutenant Governor Bob Anderson. Jim Reardon talked about we want to grow food, we want a fair price. Followed up by the state AFL-CIO's treasurer Mark Smith saying it's time to say to Ronald Reagan and his ilk out the door in '84. Pairing again these kinds of farm and labor causes together, but bringing in as a state senator from Nebraska, Ernie Chambers did. Okay? Farmers need to realize, he said, that they'll be picked off one by one, just as unions will be picked off one by one until there are no more. A call to political action. A call to saying the farmers' fight is the same as the laborers' fight, is the same as the fight of people of color across the state of Iowa. What we begin to see around 1982 and 1983 is an increased collaboration between these kinds of activist groups, Iowa Farm Unity, the North American Farm Alliance, groups like the AFL-CIO for sure that have been active in politics and as political action committees, but really beginning more at the grassroots level, coming out of those meetings in places like Waterloo and saying that yes, that we have some of these kind of organizations, but we need to be more active and in better communication with our own elected officials. Iowa's Democratic elected officials in this era in particular became more responsive to the grassroots, really intentionally began to engage the kind of ideas that we see coming out of those meetings at the Farm Labor Solidarity Day, and in turn applying them then into Iowa politics in the 1980s. And in particular, the Iowa Democratic Party got very good at doing that. The Iowa Democratic Party begins to remake itself in such a way that is designed to go out and reach voters at the grassroots in a very intentional way. Now, one of their first kind of claims and allegations was that in 1981, Iowa Republicans had led a do-nothing legislative session. Okay? But with House Minority Leader Don Avenson, okay, out of Olwine, just outside Waverly, okay, as well as workers like Tim Raftus and the Iowa Democratic Voters Program, as well as legislative directors like Joe Shanahan, okay, and party chair Dave Nagel. The Iowa Democratic Party in 1982 kicked off a really robust and really intentional program called its Democratic Voters Program. Right, this grassroots kind of program that was really intentionally going out and trying to reach voters where they were at, embracing polling, okay? And we take these things for granted maybe today in 2025, but really intentionally embracing polling, embracing the use of computers, okay? Embracing direct mail and voter education, voter listening, but voter education as well, to encourage voters to get out the vote and to see themselves as being part more broadly of this fight. They did this very intentionally. In the wake of John Culver's defeat, they said that there were half-truths, shaded facts, and outright lies, they alleged, that were used to defeat John Culver, and they saw the Democratic Voters Program as being part of the way that they would push back against this. Now, at the same time, as the Iowa Democratic Party was working to get out the vote, Iowa feminists in particular, through the Iowa Women's Political Caucus, organized really effectively in the 1982 election and launched the candidacy of Roxanne Conlon, the former U.S. District Attorney, launched her candidacy into a kind of statewide, into a very competitive race against Lieutenant Governor Terry Branstad in the 1982 elections. Now, it's worth noting that voters defaulted to kind of caricatures of both Roxanne Conlon as well as Lynn Culver running for Congress in Northeast Iowa as kind of caricatures of feminists, right? People who prioritized abortion over the economy. For Conlon's candidacy was further hurt in 1982 by admissions that she and her husband, who was a real estate developer, hadn't paid income tax in 1981 despite having a net worth of over $1 million. Um, Observers noted at the same time that she had a condition similar to that of cash poor farmers. And she announced a very ambitious $300 million bonding plan for the state of Iowa through infrastructure, through conservation, that'd be funded by a progressive income tax on higher income tax earners in 1982. She even challenged where quote are Terry Branstad's ideas. She was unsuccessful in her campaign and losing to Branstad 53 to 47. But down the ballot, okay, this kind of enthusiasm really did launch the candidacies of other Democrats that year, particularly a former teacher from Newton named Robert Anderson, who attacked both Branstad and his Republican opponent Lawrence Pope for misrepresenting Conlon's budget. Uh, Anderson cited very particularly against some of the kinds of energy concerns, some of the very pocketbook kinds of concerns that Iowans face, talking about projected 50% intentionally for a tax increase. Anderson said, quote, the wealth join the rest of us in paying their fair share. And Anderson won election that year with 52% of the vote. He became the first ever Democratic lieutenant governor to serve alongside a Republican governor. So despite the fact that Branstad wins, and we have to remember that in 82, that Branstad defeats Roxanne Conlon, and her gender likely did play a role. Okay? It didn't likely, it certainly played a role in her defeat that year. Okay? That there are down the ballot, the farther you look down the line, Democrats who are indeed winning that year. And that continues into 1984 with Republican Senator Roger Jepsen, the guy who defeated Dick Clark in 1978. With him up for re-election, Iowans who were discontent with the decline of family farming, alongside being pulled into some of these farm activist groups like the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, like the North American Farm Alliance, united voters, okay, behind Iowa Congressman Tom Harkin. Okay? The Iowa Democratic Party's Democratic Voters Program noted at the time that unemployment topped Iowans' lists of concerns. Voters mentioned unemployment 55% of the time in polls in 1984. They mentioned inflation 30% of the time, tax cuts 29% of the time, farm issues 26% of the time. And Harkin had a really effective way of reaching these voters. Okay, one person watching him speak in 1982 remarked that, quote, you would think Huey Long had returned. Now, Huey Long was a very populist, a very brash governor of Louisiana in the Great Depression, somebody very kind of in line with some of the populist farm policies here during the Great Depression. Inspired as well all the King's Men. Harkin turned those critiques of wealth against Jepsen and against his reliance on political action committee funding and amplified a great deal of those farm groups in the process. He addressed a rural caucus that was founded by the Farm Unity Coalition leaders Dixon Terry in 1984 and argued to progressive farm groups that it was, quote, the free market and Farm Bureau policies being exposed by my opponent and his unwillingness to stand up to President Reagan on farm issues, and blamed them for, quote, creating mass disenchantment among Iowa voters. Standing up to Reagan paid off for Iowans. Now, it's worth noting Reagan wins Iowa in 1984. Okay? Walter Mondale, the Democrat, wins only Minnesota and the District of Columbia in 1984. Reagan wins Iowa by 7 points. Harkin beats Jepsen that same year. You can see the map there. Harkin beats Jepsen by 12 points that year. It's almost a 19-point swing between the presidency for a Republican and the Senate for a Democrat here in Iowa. Those kinds of populist positions, Don Avenson remarked, those populist liberal tax positions, bread and butter issues, he called them, were extremely popular in Iowa elections, and not just for Harkin. But at the level of the state Senate, Iowa Democrats pick up another seat in the state Senate that year. So while Reagan wins nationally, you drill down just one level. And it turns out that, as a matter of fact, these kinds of populist progressive Democrats are winning elections and advancing their causes at the state and local level. With Harkin's win with a 60-40 House majority, with a Senate majority, the Iowa Democratic Party continued to prioritize economic development and tried to convince voters they would create an Iowa with more opportunity, as they put it. It's worth noting, though, at the same time that other groups, feminists in particular and abortion rights advocates, saw themselves in common cause with these. The director of Iowa City's Emma Goldman Clinic joined pro-choice causes with farm protests. Gail Sand, that associate director of the Emma Goldman Clinic, said, quote, "Anti-abortion is not pro-family. We've seen farm families demolished by this administration's farm policies." And it was this really intentional way of framing abortion rights as being part of the region's family structure. That the economic equality that was being caused by Reagan conservatism was affecting everybody, not just on the farms, but in the family as well. And women's leaders, particularly in 1986, really started to centralize their causes within that economic populism. State Representative Joanne Zimmerman from Waukee, whose farm herself faced foreclosure in 1986, ran for lieutenant governor. And it was because she wondered if she was sitting in a hearing on family farm credit, she later claimed. Um, Legislators needed to feel, in her words, quote, besieged by all the needs they saw around them. And it was that relatability. She was a nurse. She was lived on a family farm, helped operate a family farm, that lifted her in her run for lieutenant governor. Running that year in the Iowa primary against Iowa City State Senator Art Small, Zimmerman was outspent 2-1. Well, she claimed that it was because she threatened the quote powers that be inside the Democratic Party, including Avinson. Um, but Zimmerman benefited both from the support of women who had backed Conlin in 1982, as well as family farmers who sympathized with that attempt to foreclose on her family's operation. Zimmerman said, quote, "I'm not the first farmer to be having problems." Okay? It was that kind of messaging at the nadir of the farm crisis that really reached voters. It was candidates like Dale Cochran, who ran for Secretary of Agriculture, who traveled across 79 of the state's 99 counties, not quite pulling the full Grassley, but he did his best. He traveled across the state in a pickup camper, okay, attacking his opponent for Secretary of Agriculture that year as, quote, "a bureaucrat who was shuffling papers while Iowa's farm economy was collapsing around him." It's worth noting that all of the people you see listed there on the slide win in 1986. But while Lowell Junkins, Iowa State Senator Lowell Junkins, doesn't defeat Terry Branstad in 1986, and while Chuck Grassley indeed wins by nearly record margins in 1986, the Des Moines Register's David Yepsen actually observed that Branstad gave up, quote, vetoing populist tax bills in 1986. There was kind of an election year pivot to this economic pragmatism that we see among even Iowa Republicans in the mid 1960s. Uh, Ultimately, again, Branstad attacks on Lowell Junkins wind up winning the election for Branstad. Chuck Grassley wins in the Iowa Senate race. But you look just again one level down to the grassroots, and as a matter of fact, we see these huge kinds of victories, okay, for Iowa Democrats this year. Zimmerman again hops on a tractor and drives across the state about 150 miles from Red Oak all the way to Ottumwa, excuse me, driving a different tractor in every county, as she says it, to quote, symbolize one-on-one communications with rural and urban residents. Okay? Alleging that farmers need to hear specifically from their political representatives and need to feel heard, need to feel represented within this election. Zimmerman wins again with the support of not only the National National Organization for Women, not only with the Nurses Association, but with farmers. And Zimmerman herself brags that she, quote, ate into Terry Branstad's base. "I have an agricultural base. I didn't just call on the courthouse." Okay? Along with Zimmerman, again, Elaine Baxter wins, Dale Cochran wins. They're holding seats they haven't held since the mid 1960s. And polling actually notes that year that Iowa Democrats enjoyed a more favorable environment that's existed for many years because they've, quote, connected with voters' everyday concerns. As the Iowa Democratic Party's director, Joe Shanahan, brags about the party's fundraising advantage by 1986, the power of the Iowa Democratic Voters Program, the state's Truman Fund, their To Elect a Majority program, or the TEAM program. Even Terry Branstad concedes after the 1986 elections that there's, quote, little chance of Republican control in 1988. That's enthusiasm for this kind of party building that by September of 1987 leads Democrats in Iowa to have a 58,000 voter advantage in registrations. Democrats lead Republicans by 58,000 in voter registrations. And they've got now two networked computers, a computer database of 100,000 key Democrats. They've got this great kind of coordinated effort that they're hoping really to drive forward into state politics, but also into this kind of national impact. And Tom Harkin really becomes a focal point for this national impact of this kind of Iowa populism that's springing out of the 1980s. Elected first as again a congressman from Iowa, but then elected later on as a senator from Iowa. Harkin had founded in 1983 a group called the Congressional Populist Caucus. Okay? A group mostly made up of farm state as well as some labor district representatives that saw themselves as having the duty of amplifying the causes of the little guy in Congress. Their argument was that the National Democratic Party wasn't doing enough to listen to them. And so what Democrats needed to do, not just in Iowa but across the country, was show them how the little guy was struggling in the 1980s. And they had this very robust kind of vision for how they were going to do that. But what you see in the bottom right-hand corner here, and this is one of my favorite things that I've found doing research on Tom Harkin's life and his career. This is at Drake University. This was actually a bibliography, a reading list that Tom Harkin gave to other members of Congress. And these are works of history, long 200, 300-page tomes on the history of populism and the history of the 1890s and of the 1930s. Now, as a professor, this is a moment where you see, like, oh my God, congressmen are reading the same stuff that I had to read to get my doctorate. But it's this showing as well that Harkin believes, okay, that really truly understanding this history of populism, this history of how the little guy has been kind of pushed to the side, shunted out of view by corporate interests, really did have an effect, okay, or really could have an effect on national politics. In 1983, claiming how Iowans were struggling to make ends meet, particularly paying things like their energy bills. Harkin staged this great publicity stunt that you see here. He asked people across the country to mail him their gas bills, and staged these great photos of him just holding up these sheafs of energy bills in 1983. But the Congressional Populist Caucus as well not only tried to pass legislation that was designed to help family farmers, it tried to pass laws that would stop plant closings without notice for laborers. They tried to pass laws that would expand credit opportunities for small businesses, for family farmers. They tried to regulate energy costs. Okay? They tried to push these sorts of things and worked in tandem with some of those groups like Iowa Citizens Action, like the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition. This really did grow into a regional kind of movement, but one that started in the Iowa progressive movements of the 1980s. They also had impacts on or attempted to pass national farm legislation. It's worth noting neither of these bills did pass. But in the 1985 fights over the Farm Bill, the agricultural funding bill passed every 5 years, Harkin offered his own act called the Farm Policy Reform Act that would have given farmers more of a voice in supply management, okay, reducing the supply of agricultural commodities in order to boost farm prices, mandating conservation practices, and setting a price floor for agricultural goods. Now, the Harkin Farm Policy Reform Act was shot down in Congress, as was a subsequent one called Harkin-Gephardt. But these were bills that got support from the kinds of grassroots movements, the grassroots activists that we've seen, and expanded by 1987 to include more support from organized labor who showed up at a conference in St. Louis in 1987 called the Farmer Rancher Congress to try to support and to push forward these bills. And where we really see these bills having an impact is when Iowa hosted the 1988 Democratic presidential caucuses. Okay? And it was the man you see milking a cow there in the middle, speaking at the lower left-hand corner, riding a tractor in the top right-hand corner. Civil rights leader Jesse Jackson, who observed that the two biggest questions in the state on a blustery day in March 1987, outside of former Sears in Greenfield, Iowa. Why Greenfield? Where is Greenfield? It was here in the heartland of America, Jackson concluded, that, quote, we have seen farmers forced off their farms and businesses squeezed out of existence. But he promised at the end of our rainbow will be new policies for economic justice and the ability to enforce the policy with firmness, with fairness, and with compassion. Greenfield wasn't an accident. Okay? Greenfield was because of Jackson's connection to IFUC co-founder Dixon Terry. Hey, Jackson stayed at his farm. He did the chores in the mornings with Dixon Terry, uh, and worked to really build a populist kind of movement in the presidential caucuses of 1988 that endorsed Harkin Gephardt as, quote, the most humane piece of legislation in our times, that sought to marry the John Deere strike, plant closings, and the farm crisis all together in one kind of common cause that he believed could become part of a national movement. And it really helped him stand in marked contrast to the eventual winner, Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. You can see there Paul Simon's campaign gossiping about him, noting that Dukakis's campaign was failing to move Iowans, probably because, quote, technocrat and manager haven't added up to the feeling that was really important to these kinds of farm and progressive protest movements, that, quote, being one of us mattered to Iowans in the 1980s. Okay? There was as well Dukakis's gaffe during the run-up to the 1988 caucuses, where he suggested that if farmers were struggling, they could try planting things like blueberries and sunflowers and Belgian endive, because what Iowa farmer doesn't plant Belgian endive? Now, there was some truth and some well-meaning to his comments there, but it showed that he wasn't necessarily in touch yet with what the average Iowa farmer was experiencing. Okay? Folks who attempted to show more that they were people like Paul Simon, the senator from Illinois, the neighboring state from Southern Illinois, whose bow tie brigade, who's kind of that very kind of progressive, wholesome, small town America image, led him to be endorsed by the Des Moines Register, by Iowa Congressman, recently retired Iowa Congressman Berkeley Bedell, by former Governor Harold Hughes, nuclear freeze activist John Crystal, and more folks. Simon endorsed things like Harkin Gephardt and really called for this kind of humane approach to be restored to the Iowa Democratic Party, but to the National Democratic Party. But I keep saying Gephardt, we should probably talk about the guy himself, right? Missouri congressman named Richard Gephardt, whose 1987 Save the Family Farm Act, along with Tom Harkin, won him not only the endorsement of several farm groups, but won him the endorsement of labor groups across the state of Iowa for taking a strong protectionist stance. And Gephardt was the candidate, more so perhaps than any other than Jackson, who brought together these farm and these labor kinds of concerns together in the 1988 caucuses in Iowa. And eventually this propelled him to victory in the Iowa caucuses. It was something that put together, that tapped into, much as Jackson did, those kinds of coalitions, and made this kind of made this real strong case, okay, that it was common cause. Now, Gephardt eventually wins Iowa. He runs out of money within about a month and is forced to drop out by March of 1988. And eventually Dukakis does win the Democratic nomination. Now, Dukakis loses ultimately to George H.W. Bush, but it's worth noting that Dukakis wins Iowa 55-45. It's that same year the Democrats add 3 seats in the House. They now lead in the state House 61-39, and they credit both Harkin's spending, but credit the Truman Fund for doing that. They conduct aggressive, very issue-oriented campaigns, and they benefit from that kind of grassroots enthusiasm across the state. Okay? It's worth noting that in the wake of the Iowa caucuses that year, the folks credited this to Jesse Jackson, credited this to Dick Gephardt, and talked about how the emphasis of the Democratic campaign had shifted to being one of what they called economic justice for all. If nothing else, that was the phrase across the farm crisis, across the labor crisis, across minority causes, across women's causes. Creating economic justice for all is an overriding theme that I hope you all can take away from this talk, and take away from some of how this left-wing political resurgence was built in Iowa in the 1980s. Now, there's a longer story to be told, right? There are defeats that are going to come in the 1990s, and certainly this doesn't look like what Iowa looks like, politically at least, in 2025. But I hope that this talk can, at the very least, impress upon some of you all the ways in which there is this broader and this deeper political tradition in the state of Iowa. This broader political tradition that is one that supports the working class, supports average people in their fight against bigness, out of state interests, corporations, and helps encourage average people and indeed amplifies average people into the state's politics. It's a trend that to some of you may have gone dormant today, but it's a trend that I think is worth studying and understanding for the ways in which, at one point, the heartland spoke to the soul of America. I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank the State Historical Society of Iowa. And I think at this point, if Andrew and Matt are ready for it, I'm excited to hear some of your questions and some of your thoughts on these thoughts I've given today. But I want to thank you all first and foremost for attending.
Okay. Thanks, Cory. It was really great to hear you present on this. Really interesting. We appreciate it. We do have time for some questions and answers here, just about 9 minutes. So we've got a couple questions that have come in, but if you have questions, get them in soon so that we can get to them. I want to start off with the this is a question. The comment says not a question but a comment, but I think there's a question in it, so I'm going to read it and then we'll ask that question to you, Cory. But it says, you mentioned the full Grassley. However, Chuck Grassley was not the first politician to campaign in all 99 counties. It's probably appropriate that today we recognize that that was Jimmy Carter was the first politician to visit all 99 counties, at least prominently. His success planted the idea for future Iowa politicians, including Grassley. So that was the comment. And the question I think that's within that is, could you talk about any thoughts about the importance of someone like Carter or the caucuses, like Carter and his success at the Iowa caucuses, this grassroots approach in Iowa in the 70s? Did that inform then what you've been tracking here in the 80s? Could you take us back maybe 4 years to Carter and the caucuses as you think about what you presented today?
Absolutely, and thank you for that kind of question and the comment that inspired it. Certainly, Carter's success in 1976 does inspire this idea that grassroots campaigning, particularly within the caucuses, can be a really effective way of reaching Iowans, but of building momentum for the campaign. And it's something certainly that so a figure just in the interest of time we didn't talk about, but Gary Hart in 1984 really attempted to capitalize on running against Walter Mondale in the 1984 campaign as well. Now, Mondale famously asks him later on, "Where's the beef?" And there wasn't necessarily a ton of beef behind some of those policies. They weren't all that popular with Iowa voters, but certainly that idea of the kind of grassroots, the one of us imagery that you saw on a past slide with Michael Dukakis, that one of us kind of critique was something that was really important, particularly in these times of economic crisis, right? That Carter was certainly you heard a lot about over his career that he was a peanut farmer from Georgia, right? That kind of imagery certainly played a really important role. And it was one that again that one of us kind of mentality is something that Grassley plays really strongly into. And I think the reason that we talk about it as the full Grassley today is because he's the Iowan who does it. The Iowan who prominently does it first. And that not necessarily parochial mindset, but that kind of pride in place, that pride in state, is something that Grassley plays to really well, and that becomes a really effective way of campaigning in those caucuses. It's something that, to the best of their ability, Jackson in particular in 1988 especially tries to capitalize on because he's not a well-funded candidate. It was a way as well by getting to every one of those counties, as somebody like Dale Cochran tried to do in 1986, as Zimmerman did to an extent in '86 as well, was a way of overcoming, too, not just in the sense of being good campaign sense, but being a way to overcome some of the financial limitations that a lot of these working class, kinds of candidates faced.
Great. Thank you, Cory. Another a really great question. This comes from a rural library for context, so you know who you're talking to. But they're asking, what role did local small town editors and publishers play in determining who won things like the caucuses, or probably more broadly things like primaries, elections? Could you talk a little bit about that local news media and that news environment?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that, um, boy, we see a change from then to now, right? That particularly in terms of informing voters of where to go, informing voters of the issues, and keeping voters abreast of not just the caucuses, but of political issues more broadly, right? That you can turn into that you can read the daily paper in Waverly and see and get a direct quote from Don Avenson talking about the farm crisis and talking about these kitchen table kinds of issues that you could read in the daily paper. These politicians who very intentionally went and reached out to these local kinds of these local publishers and these local papers. Um, I think that there is certainly a way in which these small town newspapers played a role in mediating this kind of political discourse in a way that they don't necessarily today, as we've seen the nationalization of news, the nationalization of politics, a little bit of that humanity, a little bit of that individual kind of struggle that we understand in the 1980s gets lost in some of these national and oftentimes angrier kinds of narratives. As the mood has shifted towards selling papers, toward getting clicks more often than not, we see less of the kinds of on the ground, hard hitting reporting on a day to day, a year in, year out kind of a basis. Rather, it's all of a sudden you know, as Iowans, right, that all of a sudden every diner, has a New York Times reporter looking for looking to get the scoop from the man on the ground. Certainly back in the 80s, especially, those local newspapers play a huge role in the political ecosystem, the informational ecosystem of Iowa.
Perfect. Thanks, Cory. We got lots of questions coming in, but I'm going to throw you kind of a broad one, but also an interesting one, and so we'll get to as many as we can. But
Yeah.
this one says, was there a fact that surprised you in researching this, or maybe was there a document? I'm going to add that on that was particularly interesting. But what surprised you in this project?
You know, that bibliography from Tom Harkin is the one that really gets me to this day. And I had a chance actually to meet him then at Drake at an event featuring Charlie Cook and ask him about it. And he goes, "Oh yeah, I read we read those books. We learned about the populists, and to hear it from the horse's mouth, with all due respect to the senator, was a humbling moment." There's another one that I can't quote directly from, uh, because of some of the language they used, but uh, particularly in the fights around the Iowa Equal Rights Amendment, one activist named Mrs. Gerald Evans, is how she signed her letters, I believe from Blairsburg, Iowa, wrote very angrily to the State Central Committee of the Republican Party, talking about real Republicans were opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, warning them about gay marriage, about abortion, about other issues along those lines. And the executive director of the Iowa Republican Party, I believe the executive director, snapped back in a letter I don't know that he ever published, but snapped back with a profanity, an F word profanity directed at her. I don't know if he ever sent it to her, but there's a real tension between grassroots voters and political parties in Iowa in the 1980s. And I think the Iowa Democratic Party was certainly better at reaching out to those voters, in part because they were able to center it as an economic kind of a concern. And I know there was another question in the chat, I don't know if we'll get to, about this kind of economic populism. And certainly it was decentering, very intentionally decentering some of the cultural concerns and turning them into more economic causes that it was really surprising to see in these documents how brazen and how intentional Iowa progressive organizers were in the 1980s about saying that these causes, these fights are one and the same, but it really needs to begin in economic democracy.
Perfect. Thanks, Cory. I'm going to ask, we've got time for one more question, and this is one that it's coming up a couple places. I'm going to try to bring it together, but is a question about the revival of this kind of idea in today. And you're a historian, so I want to give you off the hook, right? Like I'm a historian, you're a historian. We don't prognosticate about the future or really comment on current events.
Not well, at least.
From your perspective, where if someone wants to follow these, whether it's you having ideas or digging in somewhere else, where would you encourage people to look if they want to know if this is being revived or re-engaged or how it's happening? Are there people that you read or look to comment on that? If not, if you don't have anything to answer on your own, I want to give you that out. If you can answer on your own, but also to answer these questions, where can people dive in?
I want to make sure that I remember all these parts because I wasn't doing a good Tim Walls and writing down your question as you read it.
Sure, sure.
But three levels to this. One is to read existing scholarship, and I know that I'll be providing a list to the to Matt Jane, and that hopefully the State Historical Society of Iowa can follow up with all of you on some great books, some great authors like Pam Riney Kierberg in particular, who is just marvelous on the Iowa farm crisis. Folks like Shel Stromquist and Wilson Warren, who have written about Iowa labor very extensively. That there are great works of scholarship out there that talk about this as being about this crisis and the ways in which it reinvigorates the grassroots, but um, ways in which it has applications to modern day politics. There are writers like Robert Kuttner, who are journalists who are still writing and active. Chris Lehman, who writes for The Nation, is a great person you can look to for some of these readings where they've drawn, especially in the 2024 election, attempted to go back and draw out the traditions of folks like Harkin and folks like in Minnesota, Senator Paul Wellstone as well, and apply their lessons to the modern kind of the political age. The second thing would be on a the second thing in terms of primary sources and going to some of these collections. I would love to encourage people to one, be active and make use of some of the great resources that we have in the state of Iowa. Um, you saw maybe from some of the captions, a great deal of this primary source research came from Don Avenson's papers at the University of Northern Iowa and the farm crisis collections there. Groups like Prairie Fire, Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, North American Farm Alliance all have papers and stuff at Iowa State University. The University of Iowa has the Iowa Women's Archives, where both Joanne Zimmerman and Roxanne Conlon and tons of other activists have their papers. And the campaign records of Jesse Jackson in '88 are held at the State Historical Society of Iowa in Des Moines. The Iowa Republican Party has some of its papers held there, and I'm deeply, deeply indebted as well to Hope Bibbins and the Drake University Archives for Tom Harkin's papers and some of the wonderful things that they've found. So go look into some of those primary collections as well. Look as well, please. I have a book coming out and a chapter coming out on this fight in progressive agriculture in the liberal heartland, which is coming out in April this year. But finally, my last plea, and Andrew, I know that I've taken up more than enough of everybody's time. My plea is to help preserve this history too. Whether it's in recording oral histories of your memories, if you were involved in some of these fights, if you worked on any of these campaigns that I've named and more, right? Please, please, please get involved. Contact local historical societies. Record oral histories. Donate your political papers, especially if it's taking up space in attics. Please reach out to local historical societies or the State Historical Society of Iowa, because we struggle, especially as we get into the digital era. We just don't have records of these sorts of things. And while I love my job. They they pay me great. It's wonderful to do this research. I don't have the time to pull a full Grassley myself either and travel across all the counties of Iowa. So please help donate those records and help preserve that history in a way too. That if this story appealed to you, if the lessons from this appealed to you, please help be active in becoming part of the State Historical Society of Iowa, but in giving your history as well and contributing to that history too. So not only read, but contribute and be active and help us preserve these stories and amplify them and tell them to a wider audience too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cory. With that answer, that's going to bring our webinar to a close. I know we didn't get to all of those, all the questions in the chat, but if people have more, Cory's not hard to find online. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter and my friend, Cory Haala. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There's many, many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. If you're looking to learn more Iowa history. You can find over 90 recorded webinars of past 101s at our YouTube channel, Iowa Culture. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on January 23rd. The topic will be the nature of Iowa, considering the environment in state history. Thanks so much again to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your afternoon.